My guest today is not someone who talks about the future, is someone who has built it, tested it, and then scaled it. He's built enterprise scale AI at NASA, healthcare system survived COVID, and scaled products to 600% ARR growth. And today he's building technology that small businesses around the world depend on to survive. He's a CTO, he's a futurist, and he asks dangerous question. What future will you create? James, welcome to 101 Talks. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for the warm intro.
Before NASA and before AI platforms, before the big titles, I actually want to rewind. What pulled you into technology in the first place?
Sure. So I didn't know I wanted to be an engineer. And then when I figured out I want to solve problems and be an engineer, okay, I didn't know what problems I wanted to solve. I was like, I like puzzles, but the problems themselves were sort of unclear to me. So then I think when I was just starting university, I picked up a copy of Isaac Asimov, The Foundation, and sort of talks about sort of psychohistory. And I was like, ooh, this idea of using statistics and psychology and trying to sort of like figure out how to help people sort of avoid the biases that just being human, being an animal presents into sort of solutions and problems. And it looks a lot like today you might call behavioral economics. I took more the public policy and technologist route of saying, great, well, how can I shape policy to build better technology? How can I help policymakers design policy that actually works with the technology that we have? And that was sort of where I got my start as a systems engineer and statistician and sort of process engineer, saying, like you could design, and my first role was for the US Department of Defense. And these are, huge, complex processes. And you could design a beautiful, thoughtful process that if you coded it would work great. But then when you put people in it, suddenly it starts to break down. And I think that was sort of where I got really excited. And I think sort of where my career has led is that intersection of where the technology is good, but once people start using it, it starts to rub, there's friction points and saying, okay, how do you make something that humans love to use, but is also really successful at sort of accomplishing the technical goals at the precision, at sort of, the reduce that variance that humans introduce by trying to do things and come at things in weird angles. So that was sort of how my career got kicked off, was that sort of that intersection between what people want to do and what they end up actually doing, and how technology can sort of serve.
Wow, that's a great combination with policy, psychology, and technology, right? All coming together. Okay. And what moment in your career where you thought, my this is more than a code, right? Actually, a part of something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I started my career, as I mentioned, like in the Department of Defense, and I wasn't really doing a lot of coding then. It was mostly just statistics, but it was statistics on sort of like a huge global scale. I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense is probably the largest bureaucracy in the world. So
Yes.
it's a hard thing to sort of wrap your head around, of like when you are making, one column, one change in an Excel file, and suddenly millions of dollars move one place and not the other. Troops, families are upset
Yes.
and moved around. So there was a sense of care that you had to sort of focus on, that I appreciated, that there was a mission. Whether or not you believed, in the DoD's mission, at least the stuff that I was working on, it wasn't building bombs. It was like getting food, getting supplies to various, countries and aid, making sure families and kids of service members were taken care of. But I liked that mission. And then I think my knack for statistics, I went over to work at the White House on Fukushima, the radioactive disaster, because I knew statistics, I knew how to speak sort of Navy and DoD and research. And then when that was wrapping up, I went over to the DOJ. Again, big IT projects, and that was sort of the era of early cloud. I think Microsoft Azure was still just called Microsoft Cloud. It hadn't even named Azure yet. I felt that I was building bigger and bigger projects. I was having a bigger and bigger impact, at least on the US and in some ways the world. I was trying to do right by citizens, by US citizens, like, hey, like this is your tax dollars. How do we save money? How do we, provide the best value? Real sort of civic engagement. But the further I got up, the further I got away from coding. I was like, this is not my this is not my thing. And I spent most of my evenings coding websites for friends. And I was like, I love this stuff way more than I do my day job, I think I was one of the early sort of Drupal 5, Drupal 6 core contributors back in the day in PHP, and just like hacking at it. Terrible code, looking back now. But I mean, this is pre GitHub. This is pre Git, I think, at the time, or
Yeah,
early Git.
yeah. Drupal is
So I was like,
long back.
yeah, long back. I mean, I think it's still around, but I don't know if many people use it still. Laravel has taken over, but I think the idea is like I liked the coding, and I was then sort of like I want to find a place where I can have an impact on the world, but still be coding, and like that was my day to day, and not pure statistics and Excel spreadsheets and moving money from column to column. So I sort of relaunched my career in sort of the social impact space and a lot of startups that were touching some sort of good for the world, whether that was, human capital, HR, and like equity. It was, healthcare, ironically during the pandemic, which was a wild ride, in education and AI. And that was sort of how I was able to sort of keep that. So I started with my global focus and actually found code. So it wasn't actually the other way. So sort of got into coding in order to make myself have more fun as I try to solve sort of big problems.
Oh, wow. So, what I can observe, the key point, key takeaway from here is your career is not built by chasing titles. This career is pulled forward by problems worth solving, right? That's
Yes,
how you moved forward.
yes, and I think for that is one of the things I think I try to encourage some of the young students that I mentor is that one of the things you have to think about when you're looking at a job and you're trying to consider what job to take or what career to take is one, are these problems that you're going to be excited to solve? Because you're going to be stuck in them for a long time. I myself love to focus on a problem for 3 to 6 months and then I want to move on. And some people can do a problem for 10 years. I'm not one of those. And different types of engineering have different scales of those problems. But I also think that I tend to look at jobs as one of the compensation sort of frames that I approach new roles is like, will I be learning? Because I might make a lot of money, but if I'm not learning anything, I will never get out of that job, right? I'll be stuck in that job forever. I look at sort of, how do you sort of discount out the cost of like, well, if I'm learning in this new role, I'll be more prepared for the next role. I'll be able to get that promotion, or I'll be able to pivot into a new career or to open new problems for me to solve. And if you don't have a real clear sense of what you will be learning in a new role, I think it's more dangerous. It's riskier actually to take a role where you're not learning for your career than even if the pay is better because it sort of it pigeonholes you, it locks you down. But yes, I've tried not to be driven by title. My title has changed. I was in product. I was in, like I was tons of lots of weird titles throughout my career. But all of them I think have been driven by, like and across industries. It's like, well, like what am I learning? Is this something new? Can I bring skills I have plus learn new skills I don't have? Yeah, you're absolutely right that has been I think the driving factor. And for, it's turned out pretty well.
Yeah, that's what our young career professionals, I think they should start learning this habit. Let's get into NASA. At NASA,
Mhm.
you helped build one of the first enterprise scale generative AI platforms.
Mhm.
What was your experience and how did you go about it and from where did you start?
Yeah, so the way that I ended up at NASA was as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow, or PIF, PIF. And the PIF program is a program where they take sort of mid to late career technologists, innovators, professionals who've had some success out in the private sector and say, great, come in and like we're just going to sprinkle you about in the public sector in sort of senior positions, but without any actual authority, right? We have no budget, we have no explicit, team or anything. We're just said, drop you in and say go. So the whole strategy then is to build coalitions of the willing. So you have no authority except that which you can sort of build and accumulate by convincing people to join your mission, to see your vision as something they want to help with, and then you get their budget and their team and their support. So I was sort of dropped into a team at NASA called the Convergent Aeronautics Solutions Project. Sounds, fancy. Basically, it's sort of like
Okay.
a mini sort of futurist group within NASA. And all they do was try to imagine what are the problems that humanity will face 20 to 50 years out, which is sort of a very cool problem to sort of problem space. I mean, the biggest, craziest, hardest problems humanity will face, and you're at the team at NASA trying to solve them. So, a big goal. But what they were sort of struggling with was that the complexity of the problems and the amount of data they were collecting had sort of reached the limits of human cognition. Like a team of people with their brains and like writing and taking notes manually just could not keep up. So I was brought in to sort of help. It's like, can we use sort of sort of pre-GPT-3 AI techniques to sort of like, can we start to sift through this and make sense of it? And then I think, 6 months after I arrived, GPT-3 comes out and it becomes sort of available. And it's like, oh, this has changed the game. So it became less about that project, became less about sort of how we just use AI to supplement, to sort of act as maybe a librarian over all this data, but can we actually get the AI to collaborate, to work with us, to sort of help our teams think about the future, challenge our assumptions, provide better ideas? Can you get the AI to be creative or as creative as some of your team members at NASA? And that became sort of the research and the function, which was much more exciting and interesting as the work went on. But of course, once you start building something that can help a researcher challenge their assumptions and read in their data and sort of bring in new ideas, a lot of other research teams outside of ours wanted that because NASA is full of people trying to push boundaries. We were pushing sort of the boundaries of the bleeding edge of research, but there's still a lot of boundary pushing and sort of much more sort of near term research at NASA, but they all wanted that support. So we started having those people sort of join our team and saying, "Hey, can it do this? And can you help it with this?" And it's like, "Yeah, let's tweak it. Let's build a plugin that supports your data and your team and your needs." And so we started rolling it out that way, and that's sort of how it gained steam.
Awesome. You explained it in a very, very clear fashion on how your experience was. You also have co-authored responsible AI policies, right?
Hmm.
How different is AI when the stakes are national, scientific, and global? And how does responsible AI policy come into this?
Oh, I
It's
think
a
that
big
was
question.
I It is a big question. Yes. I would say the thing that was I was struck by was the group I was in at NASA was sort of one of the things we were imagining as part of this future was how will AI as a technology impact humanity, and then how can we potentially use AI to mitigate the impacts, the negative impacts of AI on humanity and culture and education and all these sort of ripple effects that people don't think about. Because I think NASA, along with a lot of other technologists or policymakers, they think very sort of blinders on the sort of like what's in front of them, corporate policy. Will my data get leaked? How will my data be used to train other models? Like they're very sort of in the weeds and coming at the problems that they are used to and saying, okay, well now these are my problems, and now let's look at how AI impacts the same problems. And I sort of had to stop and try to pull them back and say, no, 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 AI will create actually a whole new set of problems that are actually way worse. It will solve some. You'll never have to worry about that again, but it will introduce way
True.
more. And I think the example I would suggest is, we had a lot of procurement policy of like what software was going to get bought by a large agency, and in government, procurement is a big deal. But for the most part, the procurement teams have very strict IT policies. Hey, you have to review this. The company has to check these boxes. It does X, Y, and Z. But there is this sort of notion that the technology, that the software will be released on a certain schedule. It'll be very controlled. It is most government software is they struggle to procure things in an agile way. Almost all of it is still very waterfall, because that's how they deal with the risk, right? Oh, we want the security updates, but we don't want the sort of like every day the technology might change because that introduces risks. So they tend to sort of push back on that, and that so procurement you can imagine is then 15, 20 years behind the curve on what is sort of best practice for IT and technology and software. Then you throw an AI into that, and so the world's has they have no grounding. Everything is sort of fluid and terrifying. And what I was trying to present to them was this concept that the procurement team, ironically, not the technologists, not the AI experts, not the information security officer, but the procurement team was actually being the first line of defense in procuring the right AI, because buried in all of these software tools that they were buying that were maybe being released on this quarterly cadence that was sort of like it felt safe, underneath them were now these models. But these were not models that that company had trained. So asking them about like, oh, what training data was it used? Was it, did how can you prove that it was equitably trained, that it's not biased against it? Like they have no clue. So asking them those questions is sort of moot. They're going to ask their vendor, who's going to ask their vendor, who's going to ask their vendor. So this idea of model provenance that procurement team, not IT, need to understand was sort of like totally outside of what they understood. Procurement was just not ready to have conversations about model provenance, and also this idea of model drift, that you could buy software but the underlying vendor might change, like that the responses you would get would change over time. So you can say, oh, well, it was approved in September, and by December, it's giving you different answers, and those answers might now no longer be valid.
Yeah.
They might have shifted from like a good to a bad answer. Again, they had no concept for like how to deal with that according to the regulations of sort of like how they structured. So I spent a lot of my efforts of trying to focus on thinking about that, like who was buying the software and who were sort of the ripple effects that were outside of just security and technologists. Because I assumed that the early adopters, the enthusiasts, the AI people would get it. I'm like, oh, okay, here's the risk. But as we've seen, AI is impacting so many industries that the policy areas that are, I think, most fragile and most concerning are the ones where the people who are looking at it, reviewing that, just don't even know the implications of AI because it's just, again, it's creating new problems that they're not used to and they're not even looking at. So I think the take a step back, really sort of try to challenge those assumptions about like, well, yes, that's the problem the law was written about in 1980 and updated in 1998. But maybe today, the problem is actually totally different and looks totally different. The classic example is hacking, right? So we think about hacking and security and a risk of the insider risk of like, oh, like someone clicked on a wrong link and phishing and all these things. Like, but even the framework by which we evaluate those tools was very like, well, we assumed that a hacker would only be able to do X amount of attacks, that they wouldn't be very customized, that, there's a lot of, it's very hard to do attacks at scale. And then AI has now like blown that up. They can do targeted phishing attacks where they like, the AI agent is looking up your like personal relationships, it's scraping data, it's inferring your role from LinkedIn, and like it's pretending to be your boss, but they know he's out of the country because they're looking at Instagram and seeing his photos. So it's just tons of brilliant stuff that you thought like used to be like advanced persistent threat, very targeted spear phishing, whale hunting, whatever it is, whale fishing. Now everyone is facing that threat. So there's just the scale of problems is totally different. And again, like that's just one area of one part of security, and start adding that, looking at that in every other sector. So I think the policies, if you are approaching AI policy from a perspective of let's just update and tweak, you are probably missing whole sets of problems that the best way to approach is just to really like, if we have to refresh this, if we have to think about what the world's going to look like in 10 years, design policy for that. And you might have a chance at sort of like keeping up, but tiny tweaks to policy today is just not gonna, it's not gonna keep up.
I think to summarize, for countries building fast and at a massive scale, responsible AI is very important because there's so risks and threats that we cannot see with blinders on. There are a lot of stakeholders around, right?
And I think that on your stakeholders is that the people that you have been bringing to the table as stakeholders up until now, that's insufficient. You need to broaden the type and the number of stakeholders that are brought into that, because you're going to see a lot of the impact of AI in every little bit of the business and every little bit of the government, and you have to have all of those people at the table to really get a handle on a legitimate policy. It can no longer just be sort of that small crew that maybe worked in 2017.
See, during COVID, you are leading the transformation of legacy and healthcare systems, right? Those were the
Mm.
difficult times, right? COVID. How was it working during those times for you?
I joined a healthcare company, my first healthcare mid-sized startup. It's a small company in US healthcare terms, but pretty big in startup terms. But I joined in November 2019, and they were already sort of facing a lot of scaling crisis issues. So our sort of 2x scaling problem, I had a year to get us to 2x the scale and sort of, keep costs down. Suddenly became can you get us to 10x the scale in 6 weeks? Because COVID was just this massive, just glut of testing information and data that we had to process. So we were sort of, it was a blessing and a curse. We were the company well positioned to help a lot of hospitals with COVID, but we were not prepared for that volume. And the hospitals couldn't actually afford to pay us at that volume because they were all running basically deep into the red, because whatever excess cash that they had was going to pay for, they're trying to keep people, like paying nurses that weren't actually working because they were sick with COVID and they couldn't be there. They were buying black market protective equipment because there wasn't enough to keep the doctors and nurses who were at the hospital safe. So just buying wherever they could, and just paying cash, buying it out of the backs of trucks. It was chaos. And as an IT person, I'm, working, I'm building software, trying to build this, but I'm still operating in an economic system where my payers, my customers are experiencing a chaos that is totally different than what our sort of system had been designed for. So it was very, I think the reason that we succeeded in as far as we did was because we were able to be nimble. And one of the things we had to do was say, the first thing we're going to do is say, stop using the old system. It just won't work. We cannot fix the legacy code fast enough and safely enough to get it to meet this need. We'll have to like carve out one tiny piece of this and say, that's the biggest pain point. We're going to build a whole new stack, cloud native, scale native. It's designed to do these four things and nothing else, but at crazy,
Wow.
incredible scale. And like we'd knock that out in 6 weeks, and then it's like, okay, great. That like so sort of surrender the we couldn't cut down the legacy platform fast enough to make it work. We couldn't improve it fast enough to make it work. We could start from scratch. And I think that nimbleness and that sort of willingness to sort of like put aside your baby and your product that everyone trusts, and like, hey, we're going to build something net new in the middle of a crisis is a hard ask, because then you're pulling like, hey, I'm going to pull the best 4 or 5 people out of your software team in the middle of a crisis to go work on something that doesn't seem, it's a big risk. But I think if you don't have confidence in your ability to sort of like pull that together, if you can't get a team that operates in sort of a full stack context of like, I need one DevOps person, I need an automation person, I need a DB person, I need a backend person. If you can't trust that team and they're not ready to sort of really connect the dots and represent like a system at scale, and build for that, then you will fall down. And I think one of the lessons learned there is that what I took with me to the new, to both NASA and to new companies I'm working with is that scale is hard to teach. It's one of those things where you sort of have to suffer through it, because everyone loves their framework and they love their approach. But even as Google says, everything at scale, everything breaks, but you don't know what's going to break until it starts breaking. And I think what experience at scale means is you have seen something fall down. You've seen your servers catch fire, and you've said, okay, I've had to solve it. And sometimes it's a DB query constraint. Sometimes it's a processing constraint. Sometimes it's a network constraint because you position people, I have a regional DB structure. All of these weird things that you don't think about, even as a quote senior developer for a small company, is actually a blind spot. Because if you are lucky enough to work at a company that has a massive spike in growth, you'll have very bad days. If you haven't at least thought about that, a little bit of like, well, what happens if we have 10x load in 6 weeks? If there is a pandemic and we're the solution, how do we capture that value? How do we make sure that we can like suddenly there's this massive demand for our business? How do we not lose it? And I know many more companies that had the opportunity for scale and missed it and flubbed it and then just disappeared into nothingness than I do companies that successfully captured their like moment, their viral moment, and captured all that value and were able to sort of grow from there. Most companies have a viral moment, fail to capture the value. And like that's what keeps me up at night. We're working with startups is sort of like missing those moments more so than, like not having them at all. It's like, great, if we don't have it, fine, we'll just keep, plugging away. But to have that viral moment and then miss out, and not capture all the emails and capture all that intent and capture that the money that could the capital that could have been raised, is terrifying.
And to our listeners, if this conversation helped you think differently about AI and your career, do share it with someone who's building and leading teams. This is What Out What Talks with Sachin Menon. See you in the next episode.